nice. How nice.
So we now are live, and we are here to talk about.
Okay. So, what's that?
We are here to talk about 14th Amendment, equal protection.
Yes, that's right. What would you like to know about the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, or sentence, I should say?
Well, I read all 5 sections because there's
Well,
a lot.
equal protection is in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is one of the 3 post-Civil War constitutional amendments, 13, 14, and 15, all of which are relevant to any discussion of the Equal Protection Clause, because all 3 were designed to give full citizenship to former slaves. And in one degree or another, they were successful, but fought bitterly right down to this day. I think the only one that has not been subject to a constant battle, or really any battle, was the 13th Amendment removing slavery. But aspects of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which are voting rights, are in constant turmoil. And the people those amendments were designed to help, that is the former slaves, Black people, are still the subject of one kind of attempt or another to limit their rights as citizens of the United States. It's a tragedy.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I thought was interesting about this, that it felt to me like this amendment was designed very specifically to deal with problems that they were seeing at the time in their world, because the language in this is different a little bit, I think, than what we saw in the actual Constitution instead of the Bill of Rights. And I'm looking at my notes to see.
Well, the 14th Amendment is very broad and deals with much more than the issue of Black people and others. It deals with the rights of all of us. It deals with serious questions of states' rights versus the federal government.
Yeah.
It imposes on the states limitations, and it really imposes most of the original 10 amendments on the states. Like the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment didn't necessarily apply to the states. It applied to the federal government, but not necessarily to the states. It was the 14th Amendment. Through the 14th Amendment, it applies to all the states. As does the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause, I think, is more obviously designed to have equal rights among citizens, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Whereas the Due Process Clause, deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process, may be the most litigated section of the Constitution.
That's interesting. I would have
You have gone away.
I have gone away. That's because
there you are.
I'm showing everybody the
14th
actual
Amendment.
14th Amendment.
Yep. There it is.
One of the things, the tension between the states and the federal government seemed pretty obvious in this, but I had a question about the very beginning. All persons born or naturalized in the United States. So that would be anyone who's actually gone through the process, the official process of becoming a United States citizen. That's somebody who's naturalized.
Correct.
Okay.
That's right.
So born or naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. So if you
Correct.
officially live somewhere, you are under that state's jurisdiction.
Correct.
Then it says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. That makes sense. And that's
Right.
getting the state, that's stopping the states from doing stuff to us that the federal government says no to. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Is due process defined anywhere else?
No. Due process is a growth from the through case law, whether some of it goes back to English common law, heavily developed in the United States and in the states in every jurisdiction because it relates to liberty.
Right. And property.
Property, it relates to that aspect of property that prevents or purports to prevent a jurisdiction. It could be a state, it could be a city, it could be the federal government. That you have to have, you can't take a person's property without due process of law. You can't take their liberty, certainly if their life. By due process, we mean those processes of law, whether they relate to jury trials, whether they relate to decisions by courts. You can't arbitrarily go and deprive someone of those rights which are guaranteed by the United States Constitution, by the constitutions of the various states, without going through requirements of law, whether it's local law, state law, or federal law. So it prevents somebody from coming in and just taking your house.
Right. And I don't know that people my age would, unless they loved their history class like I did. I don't know that people understand that the British, not just the British government, but British soldiers were known for walking in and appropriating your home or your food supply or whatever. And certainly during the Civil War, I know it went, both sides did the same thing. But
well, I think during a war, I think a war is a lot of rules that apply in peacetime don't seem to apply in war. I mean, if you've got a bunch of soldiers and they're hungry, they're going to come take your food.
Right.
And I mean, you can try and sue them. Good luck with that. By the time you get a court involved, the war is probably over and they're long gone. So let's not equate it with that. I think the fear is more of a taking of property by an agency of the state, without payment, without some process to determine the value of the property, or more important, the liberty aspect of it, of throwing people in jail without trial, without of what we call due process judicial procedures. And the 14th Amendment guarantees to every citizen of the United States, wherever they live, that the state can't do that.
Now that
nor can the federal government. Federal government can't do it either.
Okay.
But that was covered in the Fifth Amendment. The 14th extends all of that to the states.
And does the 14th Amendment also extend that to people who are not born here or naturalized here? Because
I think that's a very good question.
Half sentence is very interesting. And I
think that's a very good question. The difference between the language in the 14th Amendment relating to citizens and defining who they may be, due process and equal protection of law to persons.
Mm-hmm.
From that, you can make the argument that anybody who's actually here, uh, uh, even if he or she is not a citizen, uh, has some due process, uh, particularly protections under the 14th Amendment. And look at that. I mean, for instance, if a non-citizen is arrested for a crime,
Mm-hmm.
allegedly committed, uh, wherever in any city, um, that person um, has all the due process rights under the criminal law that a citizen has.
Right.
I think you're looking at more in a much more difficult current issue of immigrants, of
Mm-hmm.
immigration, and whether you can have immigration arrests and put people in so-called immigration prisons. Uh, and I think this area is very difficult and not settled
Well, and there's
at the
half a
moment because
sentence.
it's not a crime as such.
Right.
They're not being arrested for having committed a crime under the penal law. They're being detained, if you will, on the grounds that they don't belong there. Which, I mean,
Well, it says
those are
says at the end that nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due
person.
process. And then there is the semicolon, and then it says, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
Right.
Which would mean anyone who's living in that state.
Well, I think that's um,
That's the tricky part.
well, I don't know, it's very interesting, the use of persons in both of those sentences. Um, I think is very interesting in terms of what the framers' intent might have been. Applying the Equal Protection Clause, I don't want to get so off base. I mean, it's an interesting question, and we have lots of difficult questions under the Equal Protection Clause, and whether an illegal immigrant, rather than a legal, lawful immigrant, has a whole passel of rights that anybody else has. You're raising the question of the unlawful immigrant, the person who has snuck across the border or whatever. And I don't want to get off on that for a couple of reasons. One, I don't know a hell of a lot about it. I really, so I don't want to. People think that they're hearing something here.
Well, and it's not settled,
that's
right?
based on anything other than speculation. I think there's a lot of litigation going on in this area, not necessarily on equal protection, but certainly on the due process. The difference here, you've got two different clauses here. Due process relates, as the courts have said, Supreme Court has said quite recently, to concepts of liberty. Equal protection deals more with concepts of equality, and yet in some very important cases, the cases are decided under both clauses as a deprivation of both due process and equal protection. So let's start with the most famous example of equal protection, which is a case called Loving against Virginia, which is where an interracial couple, white man, I believe, if I remember, and a black woman, were married in the District of Columbia, where there was no limitation on marriages of that sort. Then they moved to Virginia, and Virginia's statutes at that time prohibited marriages of interracial couples, and indeed it was a felony for which you could be sentenced to prison for not less than 1 or more than 5 years.
5 years for getting married?
Right. For a black-white marriage, or was considered to be, Indians, for instance, were considered in that also. Now, the Loving sued. They sued the state of Virginia, and the state won all the way through the courts of Virginia, including the Supreme Court of that state. And the case ultimately went to the United States Supreme Court, which reversed and made all such laws unconstitutional
Mm,
on the ground that it denied these people the equal protection of laws. And that is, a marriage properly consummated in the District of Columbia had to be recognized by the state of Virginia. And in addition, Virginia's state law, using race as uh, uh, making race as a criminal act, uh, violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
right.
And you can't, if race is a factor in any state statute, the justification that the state has to make is extreme to try and uphold that justification. The courts do not look at them for a very long time. But the Loving case made that extremely clear. One of the justifications that the state of Virginia had, and many states had in similar kinds of statutes, was, well, we're not denying equal protection of the law because the penalty for the white person and the black person is the same. In other words, they go to jail for the same amount of time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that was one justification. The other was, it was interesting in the Virginia Supreme Court at the time, was that state interest, supremacy of the white race. Well, the Supreme Court said that is not as a totally unacceptable justification, nor will we accept a justification that we're sending people, the prison terms are the same. The issue is whether citizens to marry can be abridged in this way. That is not, although the state has an interest in marriage, certainly, people have a fundamental right, whoever they want. It's just, I think it's 1967 or something like that.
Oh, wow.
But in that concept comes up a whole bunch of other cases that are going to come up between rights that are lawful in one state that are not lawful next door in the next state. And how do you deal with that? Well, of course, we've had, that's one equal protection issue, and it's a really major one. And race-based, gender-based statutes that are sought to be imposed that way require not just strict scrutiny, but such scrutiny that it's almost impossible for a state statute like that to stand. Whereas other things, the state may make other kinds of distinctions. But before we get to that, another famous equal protection case that doesn't involve the concept of what's legal in one state is not in another, is schools, is Brown against the Board of Education. Yay. Separate but equal, so-called separate but equal schools. Right. And of course, that was decided earlier. And separate but equal schools, as you know, which were rampant throughout much of the southern, all of the South of the United States, and some other places as well. Supreme Court found a whole raft of cases there that separate but equal was inherently unequal and denied equal protection of the law to the students. And so all those laws were eradicated, but fought, and they're still being fought right now.
Yeah.
Not quite on the same grounds, but the background is the same. We're seeing it. We're going to have lots of arguments coming up, I think, in the next 2 years about public schools versus charter schools.
Oh, yes.
The way the new Trump administration, the way the new Secretary of Education wants to handle these things is going to raise a whole bunch of these issues.
Yeah.
So nothing ever dies in the United States courts. It just it comes back again with another head. It comes back in some different way.
It's not quite the Chancery Court, though, that England had to go through, where you had to.
No, it's not. But it's a very slow process, and what you find being a student of history, as you are, and we talked about last time, is that the very battles between the federal government and the states uh, over power at the time of the revolution, at the time of the drafting of the Constitution, they're all still with us. They may have other guises, but they're all compromises at that time, early in the Republic, to maintain the Republic, to put it together and keep it together. And you could argue that it wasn't worth the effort, but that's a different. I think that's a somewhat different issue. But it's different. It's not based on race, and it's not based on gender. In some states, the smoking of marijuana and the use of cannabis products is legal, and in most states it's not.
Huh.
So you buy your little baggie of whatever in Colorado, let's say, and you drive into California, and they arrest you, and you're going to argue, well, it's equal protection. It was legal where I bought it. I could have smoked. And their answer is, well, you could have smoked it or eaten it there, and we wouldn't have bothered you. But you decided to come here, where it ain't legal.
Interesting.
And they may say, well, it's really fanciful, but I guarantee you those arguments are being made, and they're going to be made more and more as more and more states get involved in this.
Well, that was exactly one of my questions, because when you had mentioned race-based laws that this particular section has helped to strike down, you mentioned not just race but also gender, and it dawned on me: is this one of the pieces of text that lawyers are relying on when they go up against the really, really restrictive abortion bills?
Yes, it will be. It will be. But remember, abortion, the original abortion case, when you go back to Roe v. Wade,
right,
are not decided on this basis. They were decided on the basis of a concept of personal privacy. A woman has a zone of privacy in which she can operate and make these decisions. So it's not exactly an equal protection case, more of one as we move down the line, as these more restrictive abortion laws are coming back in.
Right.
The Roe v. Wade left so much room open for these kinds of statutes, like the one that was just signed in Ohio,
yes,
the 20-week statute, that we're going to be facing years of these kinds of arguments. But that was it's a little bit different because the basis of the decision was different.
So,
and the fact that you can legally get an abortion in New York, does that mean that Idaho has to, some doctor in Idaho has to grant you your right to an abortion? The answer is no. It doesn't mean that. But it may mean that certain restrictions that a state puts on abortion, if it violates, at least as of now, the strictures of Roe v. Wade, are unconstitutional.
Right.
But what they are, how you define that, has been the subject of lots of case law. But this isn't over by any means.
So with the Ohio, that was one of the ones that was on my mind, obviously, because it just recently happened. But when you're, if I were living in that state, and if I were young enough to be able to get pregnant now,
yes,
that's
we'll pass that issue.
Kind of an important part of the whole process. But if I did get pregnant and I was in a situation where abortion was going to be part of the deck of cards that I put in front of me and said, okay, well, what are our choices? If the Ohio legislature had passed that, but someone had immediately filed charges against the state for that having crossed the line with Roe v. Wade or equal protection or the privacy laws, does that mean that law is then on hold until the court finally makes a decision? Or does that mean
it's not on hold? The law applies. The law actually applies.
Okay.
This law in Ohio, which is passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, that is now the law of Ohio. and it will remain the law of Ohio until and unless some court with proper jurisdiction says that's unconstitutional. And that, of course, is being, those suits have already been brought, and they'll
Right.
start in the United States District Court. And the courts have the power, of course, to enjoin the operation of the law, of that statute. So that a district judge is confronted with this issue, if he or she decides that it is unconstitutional, that court has the power to stop the operation of the law temporarily, at least until the matter is decided by the highest court that will handle it.
Right.
But until and unless that happens, that abortion law in Ohio is the law. Now, another equal protection case is based upon the LGBT case that was decided very recently
The North
in
Carolina
the Supreme Court. The
Oh.
marriage, same-sex marriage cases,
Right.
they're all equal. They are both due process and equal protection cases. And the opinion, I just read it, as a matter of fact, in preparation for this conversation, is a very long, a difficult, and of course, highly controversial opinion. There were certainly a lot of dissents in there
Right.
about over the definition of marriage, over the definition. This kind of marriage as a fundamental right, which the majority of the court found to be so. So that's the latest major equal protection case, and of course, it's a very important one
Right.
in its effect throughout the United States.
Right.
So some of them deal. I mean, that's another one that deals with what's legal in one state has to be upheld in another. But as I've said, if it's not a race classification, if it's not like for other race cases involve public transportation, they involve voting rights, they involved public accommodations, schools. Those were the major due process equal protection cases that came along in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And as you can see, they still come. But if it isn't that, if the state can show some legitimate power interest in the state, such as, well, one case that's definitely going to come up is if you're in Arizona, which used to be your home state,
Yeah.
and you had an open carry law, you carry your gun around with you,
Right.
and you decide over the weekend you're going to go to New York to see Hamilton, and you want to carry your gun into the theater, which of course New York will not permit. Does New York have to recognize open carry law from Arizona? But right now we would say no, though the state of Arizona may have the right to pass such laws. New York has the right to not permit that under its view of the police power. That doesn't mean you can't argue. I mean, logically you could argue that, but there the Supreme Court is going to give various states a lot of latitude on those kinds of public policy issues, as distinct from gender and race issues.
That's interesting, and it's interesting to think of how thin the line is between something being legal and something not being legal. When once you start looking at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all of the amendments and breaking them down into not just what was written, but what the precedent has become over time, the foundation that the country is built on feels a lot less solid, because the way everybody had talked about it during the last 30 years, 40 years of presidential campaigns and everything, the attitude that came across to me anyway was that the Constitution is this document that has been carved in marble, and it means what it means, and that's all that it means, and you can argue as much as you want, but it really comes down to the language in the document. And now that we're actually getting into the language in the document, it doesn't feel that marbleized anymore.
It's not. It never was.
On purpose, right?
If you compare the Constitution of the United States is brilliant in many ways,
Hmm.
uh, but it's very general. A lot of, like you use the term due process. What does that mean? Well, it means what courts say it means, and that changes generationally. It changes as with experience and over time. Um, Even the originalists who believe the Constitution was written in stone somehow. Uh, that's belied by 300 plus years of decisions about
Right.
various aspects of the Constitution, what they mean. You can take something like the Commerce Clause. Well, so it gives the federal power in interstate commerce. Well, what does interstate commerce mean?
Right.
Particular case, where a state wants to tax a trucker coming across the line. What does
Hmm.
interstate commerce mean? What did it mean during the Depression when the people from Oklahoma were trying to flee the state and all moved to California?
Right.
And California stopped them at the border with guns. And finally, the Supreme Court finally said you can't do that. That's a
Cross that.
violation of the Commerce Clause. But there's no aspect of the Constitution that's not debatable under a particular set of facts. It doesn't operate that way. Um, as distinct from many state constitutions, which are the opposite, where they really, through legislation, year after year after year, try to define everything in the document. New York probably is the worst example of that, where the Constitution is endless because every year they're amending the Constitution. Well, you'll notice it's very difficult to amend the federal Constitution.
Yeah.
Extremely, and was designed with that in mind. So it's up to the courts. It's also up to Congress. It's also up to the president
Right.
to try and define meaning in the Constitution. And remember, these three centers of power
Hmm.
are rubbing up against each other all the time. So that the great debates with the Obama administration about his use of so he couldn't get Congress to do things, and so he did them himself. Well, how legal was that? Well, it depends on what it was they tried to do. Well, who's going to ultimately make that decision? Courts are going to make it. Does that
Right.
mean that Congress doesn't have the power to make decisions about what the Constitution means? Not at all. Congress makes those decisions with almost every piece of legislation that it passes. And
Hmm.
you go into the legislative history, you'll see the congressmen and senators fighting on the floor or in committees
With sticks sometimes.
over exactly sometimes. So over what does this really mean? So it's absolutely not written in stone. It's designed. It was designed for experience.
Mm. One of the
World has. Not everybody believes that, of course, but that's the fact. That's the way it has grown.
that's it's
So if you want to look at 570 volumes of United States Supreme Court cases, you can say, okay, that's the Constitution. Good luck with that. but that's what
supporting document.
scholars have to do all the time.
Right. Well, and when students are in law school, I mean, this is what you guys spend your time doing, right? This is you have to read
You
all the
read cases.
precedent-setting
You have to
things.
read statute. You read cases that interpret statutes, that interpret the
Mm.
Constitution. This is tricky stuff. I mean, some things that you think are very obvious on their face, some of them are.
Right.
But that's not always the case. Every time we think we know something, and by the way, experience changes. After all, separate but equal school facilities was the law of the land under a case called Plessy against Ferguson that was decided in 1893 or somewhere around there. It's not that nobody questioned that. That was what the Supreme Court had decided. And we all know the facilities certainly were separate, but they were not equal.
Right.
But that, the real basis of the argument that was fought out was, can you really do that? Is that equal protection of the law when you separate the races out? And ultimately, in Brown, the court said, no, you can't do it.
Right.
And you went through all of those public accommodations cases that raised all the same kinds of questions. So, what's the limit of state power in that area? And the answer now is very limited indeed.
Right.
But before that, before 1954, that was the law.
Right.
Um,
So when you look at something like section 3, the beginning of section 3 makes perfect sense. It's saying that nobody can be a senator, a representative in Congress, president, vice president, any kind of elected office, civil or military, anywhere in the United States, if you have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States or any of its states, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. This is interesting
Well,
to
you want to go back
me.
into history. Remember, this is a Civil War amendment.
Right, that's part of what.
So this amendment was proposed in 1866, and you, as a state, if you were a Confederate state, you couldn't be readmitted to the Union unless your legislature passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And that wasn't so easy. Some of them refused to do it for a while, but eventually they all did.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
So you got to put it in its historical context. Now, so most of that doesn't apply to anybody anymore because they're all dead. But that's not to say you couldn't construct a kind of interesting hypothetical.
Well, and not so hypothetical.
Of doing some, let's suppose that you go abroad and join the ISIS crusade against the United States, and you change your mind later on. You move back to the United States, and you run for Congress, the United States Senate. And your opponent says, "Nah, you're not qualified to run because you were insurrection against the United States." Well, some court's going to have to decide that. They probably have. They probably already have in some earlier insurrectional period, but I don't know the answer to that.
But there's another thing I think that's fascinating, which is having started paying attention. I mean, I started paying attention during Watergate because everybody was paying attention during Watergate, but I started really paying attention to politics when Reagan got into office. That was when I was in high school, and so I was there and in college during the Iran-Contra hearings, and Iran was on our not a friend list at the time.
Definitely not. No.
So engaging in selling arms that included Iran, couldn't Oliver North have been nailed on Section 3?
Well, he was nailed. I don't think it was on Section 3. There was a specific statute that he violated. So they never got to get to that constitutional issue. He violated a criminal law and was convicted.
So they didn't have to go any further than that?
No. He violated an existing statute.
What about outing a covert CIA operative? Would that be considered giving aid or comfort to the enemy?
It's a very broad term, and I'm not saying you couldn't. Usually you don't have to, as in the example you just gave. But could somebody push an argument, aid and comfort to the enemy argument? There's a lot to that. The enemy, did we have to have declared war? We're not good at declaring war anymore. We just go fight. So you've got a lot of subsidiary questions that lawyers properly would throw up in defending their clients. What does that really mean? What has to have happened? What government action has to make them the enemy?
Right.
Whereas remember, the history of the amendment is dealing with the Civil War. There was no question about who the enemy was. Whereas today, Iran are they the enemy? Well, a lot of people think so. They probably are in many respects. Of course, we do business with them. Boeing just sold a whole bunch of airplanes. Is that giving aid and comfort to the enemy? Well, I don't think you can call Iran the enemy in the sense of a war. There's no war going on legally between the United States and Iran right now. Right. And I think that's important.
Right.
The fact that and bomb places in Yemen or some Somalia doesn't mean that we're at war with them. From a technical standpoint, Congress hasn't declared war. So it'd make the application of that pretty difficult.
Talking about this with you, it makes the line that got such laughter aimed at it justifiably for the lay population of the country when Clinton said it depends on what your definition of is. As soon as we start getting into some of this stuff where you break it down and go, well, it's going to depend on what you mean when you say enemy. You start to say,
Sure.
oh, well, that's why he thought that was a
Well,
legitimate thing to bring up.
Well, I think lawyers, having been a lawyer for a zillion years, we do some very stupid things, no question about that, and can be very difficult people. I don't know why anybody would marry a lawyer. That's a big mistake. I did, of course. But as you see, just in this little conversation that we're having, arguments, points of view, with the political points of view or logic, when you come down to trying to define something that's going to affect, in a really important way, somebody's liberty,
right,
somebody's rights, you got to tread very, very carefully. I think too often we allow our politics to cause us to pass legislation that we really haven't thought about in any serious way, except we're angry. Like the North Carolina legislature just tried to take all the power away from their governor. Whether that'll stand or not depends on more things than I can get into or even want to get into. But what I'm saying is it ain't so simple.
Yeah.
When it comes down to whether somebody's going to go to jail or whether the property is going to be taken from them, by tread carefully means lawyers are important, and they're important to protect our rights just as important as they are to prosecuting those that society calls wrongdoers or felons and so on.
Right.
And I think one of the great strengths of our country is that lawyers, when they're used properly, in the sense of really trying to prosecute and defend the rights of the citizens of this country, or the persons living in this country, if you will. There just aren't a lot of places in this world where you have those protections.
Yeah.
In most places, whatever the executive says is the law.
Right.
There may be a legislature, it probably is. Dictatorial societies, you don't have independent courts. You don't have independent court system. They just enforce the edicts of the people in power, or in political power. The United States is very different from most countries, not all, but most countries in that respect. And we should be quite thankful for that.
Well, and I think proud of it too.
As irritating and time-consuming and expensive as it all is, and it doesn't always come out right, but you got people worrying about it all the time, and that's good.
Right.
That's good.
Well, you'd rather have them doing that than just saying, oh, well, sucks to be you now that you're in prison for 5 years for getting married. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
But it also makes me think that some of the attitude towards treating the Constitution during election years as though it is a simple document that is just so simple as to be self-evident, which it's not. That mistake of logic seems to me to be on the same playing field as the I don't trust scientists because they've got skin in the game argument. And it's I know because my dad's a scientist and I grew up around scientists, that one of the things that the lay public didn't learn in high school or didn't learn and remember is that the word theory in science is not the same word theory that they use when they say, well, theoretically, what would happen if I went and had a beer at the party this weekend, Mom? That's not the same kind of theory that you have when you're talking about scientific research and
Of course not.
scientific work.
Sure.
And it seems to me that there's a similar thing happening with the law, that there's an attitude that we have out in the public, that I've certainly had out being part of the public, where the assumption is that the lawyers are engaging in some kind of trickery. They're trying to trick you with their words, or with hiding the truth somewhere in the language, which is clearly possible to do because these things are hard
Sure.
to read. However,
And it happens. And it happens. It happens a lot.
sure,
Because
and
the lawyers, remember, the lawyers are not only representing parties as they would in a case, but lawyers are advising political figures all the time. They all have their own lawyers.
Sure.
And they take the kind of position that you're just talking about here, sort of loose thinking, is more a political issue than a legal issue. It's,
right.
I don't like public schools because, and so I'm going to find some way to change them to meet whatever my view ought to be. And I've got 7 lawyers over here who are going to try and figure out how to get around state laws that would prevent me from doing that.
And it makes sense why something like the ACLU is so important, because
whether
you and whether you,
absolutely,
I mean, they have fought for things that I disagree with fundamentally.
Sure.
But now that I'm looking at this stuff, there is no question but that the little guy needs access to really good lawyers just as much as somebody who's really incredibly wealthy.
And the courts have said that. Now, whether in practice, I mean, that becomes an economic issue about appointed lawyers. But, over the years, certainly in the last 2 generations, we've gotten a lot better about trying to protect the rights of, at least in the criminal law, of the accused. But then you've got an economic power imbalance, which is a somewhat different issue. And then you get all the power of the state on one side, and you have the legal aid society on the other, which is a real problem. And the ACLU deals with protecting people's civil liberties under the Constitution. And as the main character said in The American President, that movie some years ago, why aren't you a member of the ACLU? The president said to his political opponent, who was bashing him for having an ACLU card. Well, the fact is, we all should have ACLU cards or something like it, because they and others are organizations that have no other design whatsoever but to protect our rights, our meaning all of us. As you say, ACLU certainly has taken positions that appall me at times, but I understand why they're doing it.
Yes. Yes, because
and I applaud why they're doing it, even if I disagree with them.
Well, and that's one of the things we tend to be, and I'm including myself, we tend to be so short-sighted, and if you're only thinking of the immediate issue and not thinking of the repercussions, then you're gonna get some laws.
Well, sure. The ACLU has represented the Nazis when they wanted a parade in that city outside of Chicago, and and I was appalled. The city is full of Skokie, Illinois. It had this massive Jewish population, many of whom were concentration camp survivors. Here, the Nazis want to parade down the street, and my God, I'm not going to renew my dues. And then you stop and think about it, and as abhorrent as that is, you pay your dues, because I could be the next guy who wants to march down the street with everybody yelling and screaming at me, which is what happened.
Right. And you want to be protected.
I want my right to be heard.
Yes.
To be protected at least as much as the Nazis are,
Yes. Yes.
So, we have Nazis with us again. They never went away, but
no.
And we hear them, and they're saying all the same vile, contemptible things, stupid things, because they're stupid people. But do they have a right to say them? Yes, they do have a right to say them.
Sure.
Up to a point,
up to inciting.
Up to the point of violence, but they're entitled under the Constitution of the United States and the First Amendment to say the basic tenets of their imbecilic beliefs. Uh, well, so am I. I have that
Right.
right too, and Donald Trump has that right, and we all have that right, and it's a good thing that we do.
Right.
Um,
But that
and we
also
need
makes things very complicated.
it does, of course, it does, and it makes things politically very volatile. But we're a very political, volatile society.
Right.
Right now we have millions of us who voted for Hillary Clinton and gave her a majority of the popular vote, but today lost finally the election in the Electoral College.
Yep.
So we've got a lot of very unhappy people, including myself,
And a lot of very scared
and
people.
or including myself. But
Yeah.
we also have the Constitution of the United States, and we have a lot of people, lawyers and non-lawyers, who want to make sure that our democracy is protected in case things go off the rails, in case things that we fear actually occur.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, and so these legal documents that we started writing 300 plus years ago
Yeah.
are always very important. And in the next several years, we'll be once again at the forefront of lots of legal and political battles. And we'll all be in there fighting them.
Yeah. Well, and last
One
week
way or another.
when you were working on getting the show down, I took Ben Franklin's speech to the Constitutional Convention, the final speech he had to have James Wilson read because he was too ill to stand up and do it himself. But it's the one where he says, in a couple hundred years, the people will become so corrupt that they'll require a despot because that's the only kind of government they'll be able to live with. And I thought, oh man, when I read this in 1993, I thought, wow, that's so down. What a downer, man. And
we just had 62 million or so. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Vote for the incoming administration because they wanted change. Is he the guy on the white horse they really wanted? Well, I don't know. We'll find out over the next year or so.
Yeah. Well, and there's an interesting thing that's going on too that I'm seeing. I've seen it on CNN, but I've also seen it in the people who I know around where I live. There are many, many people who voted for Donald Trump for change or because they were afraid of terrorism and felt that he would be the toughest toughest opponent to the quote unquote bad guys. And I'm putting that in big fat quotes. But when I asked them questions about actually building a wall, actively sending people who are children of people who came here illegally, of sending them out of the country, of all the things that, as a high school teacher in New York City, things that make my blood run cold, the people who I know and the reasonable, rational people who I see on CNN, they have decided that won't happen because that couldn't happen. Oh, he won't do that. No. That was just rhetoric.
Well, I think a lot of people feel that way. We don't know what he's really going to do. I don't know that he knows what he's going to do.
Well,
there are certain aspects of his program that will be opposed by people who supported him.
Mm-hmm. And there's some stuff that he said that I thought was great.
Well, I think the idea, for instance, and he may have a lot of trouble with this, of rebuilding the infrastructure of the country,
right,
which I'm very much in favor of.
Absolutely.
He may find that very difficult to do with his own party. He may get more Democratic backing there than he'll get Republican backing, because a lot of folks who he's bringing into his administration and who come from the Republican Party want to know how we're going to pay for that $1 trillion little job.
Yeah.
And
if you keep cutting taxes,
I mean, that's always been a very major problem, and it doesn't go away because the guy who was elected says he's going to do it.
Yeah,
do it. I hope he figures out a way to do it.
It would be great,
as distinct from building a wall, 1,200-mile wall along the border.
Yeah, that's not going to happen somewhere else.
That's absurd. I mean, that's absurd, and I think I think almost everybody knows that's absurd and it's
Yeah.
not likely to happen.
Well, and for somebody who lived on the border, I mean, really,
Yeah, right. You live in Tucson.
you should really spend that concrete on fixing the bridges in Minneapolis.
Sure. Sure. I don't think anybody seriously thinks he's going to do that.
Yeah.
Or
It
can do
appears
it.
that way. Yeah.
So there's a big difference between the rhetoric that takes place during in the United States and what you actually can do later on. But we don't really know. I mean, we're in a situation where one party now controls all the aspects of the federal government. And I think everybody's very much afraid that some nastiness that otherwise might be difficult to achieve will become easier to achieve, and it will. But you're going to get around to some fundamental things like, you've got some people running around, let's get rid of Medicare and all of that. I have visions of New Yorker cartoons of people lined up, Republicans lined up here, like mine, lined up on the road saying, "Don't touch my Medicare." Because I know that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Paul Ryan, to the contrary notwithstanding, when he starts stepping on those Republican toes,
yes,
they're going to stop him. I firmly believe that. Of course, I firmly believe that Trump wouldn't win. So what do I know? But I think the senior citizens, the elderly in this country, have enormous political power.
Yes.
When they want to exercise it. And
yes.
medical care is at the heart of our lives.
Yes.
And if you think, I don't believe we are going to let any government tamper with that.
No,
except to make it better.
But I'll tell you, the thing that the kids are talking about is how the larger voting body, which is the baby boomers, the now aging baby boomers, are going to sacrifice every generation after them on the altar of living longer. And they're scared.
Well, sure. Well, I think that's a real problem, but it's not a political problem of the kind we've been talking about here. I think it's a technological that creates serious political issues.
If the only water, if I'm in Flint, Michigan, and the only water I can get a hold of is the horrible tap water that they're, doesn't that deprive me of life? My kids are now brain damaged.
Well, you certainly you have some legal recourse if your kids are brain damaged. One would hope that people in Flint do have that problem specifically, but that wasn't what you were talking about. You were talking about what is longevity becoming its own political issue as it relates to Social Security, as it relates to health care, as it relates to those things that the federal government and the states spend most of their budgets on, other than the military. That's a real problem. If instead of people dying at average age of 70 and they die at 100, everybody lives to be 100, could we afford these things? Not in their current, not the way they're currently constructed. Could you recreate a system that would cover that? Sure, if you have the will to do it, you can. But yeah, I see that as I see people living longer as a potential problem, but it's not one that it's not a constitutional issue we have to face today.
Not
you and
not
I. Mean,
so
you may have to face it, but I won't.
And I think you'll probably be happy about that.
Yeah, well, there are some things I won't mind giving up.
when during your lifetime, has there ever been a period where one political party owned all three branches, all of the checks and balances? Was that FDR?
Yeah. Well, yes, I think the Democratic Party had control certainly in the 30s and the 40s, and then it started being fractionalized.
Well, once you got
during the first 2 years of Obama's administration, you had Democratic Party had control of the government, and that's how Obamacare got passed. And it was in the midterm elections that they lost that power.
Right. Because people didn't want insurance.
No, I wouldn't. I don't think.
No, I know it's much more complicated than that.
It's too complicated right now for. I mean, Obamacare in and of itself, and healthcare more generally, is immensely complex.
Yeah.
It's going to, we're going to destroy it root and branch.
Yeah, except this part, and except this part.
It's not going to be so easy to do, and it shouldn't be so easy to do.
Yeah.
Well, and what are you going to replace it with? I've read the 7 different Republican proposals, pieces of which make sense, other pieces of which don't. What they're going to end up with, since they have all this power right now, and a president who might very well sign whatever legislation like that they put through. It's hard to say. It's very hard to say.
It is an interesting concept, though, because I hadn't heard that there were any proposals. So the fact that you've read several, that gives me hope.
Yeah, Paul Ryan has a proposal. There's another one that there are 7 out there. Some of them are very similar to each other.
Right.
In one way or another, they all want more privatization.
Sure.
Less government involvement in this. And once again, you get down to how do you finance any of these things? Everybody talks about tax credits and all that. Yeah, well, you got millions and millions of people to whom tax credits are irrelevant.
Yeah.
The economically impoverished could care less about tax credits. They don't pay any taxes.
Yeah. They could get rid of the alternative minimum tax just as a kickoff. That would be great.
Well, yeah. Well, the Republicans say they're going to do that. So
yippee!
Okay with me.
Awesome.
But I don't. At this point, I don't know really what they're going to do, or what will come out of. I mean, so just say tomorrow we're going to get rid of Obamacare. We're going to take away the health care of 20 million people or whatever it is. And it's just absurd. I mean,
well, and
so
again,
you'll be in power for 2 years, and that'll be the end of you.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Because you're going to have millions of Trump voters who are going to vote against you.
Yeah,
and properly so. So I don't believe it's going to happen. It won't happen that way. I think they're going to try and make some. It's going to be changed. There are parts of it that need to be changed.
Right.
But it's an immensely complex statute that is going to require an awful lot of work to properly amend. By properly, I mean amend it in some way that makes sense.
Right. That's workable.
And and they're going to try, and lots of people are going to try and do it. And in the end, it's going to be money. It's always money.
Right. Well,
how do you pay for it? How do you give these people health benefits? You really just kind of like the Tea Party said, the hell with them. We don't care whether they get health benefits. Well,
you do if you're.
That's not a very popular position.
Yeah. No, and it's the if you ignore the fact that there is a social contract, whether you like it or not, then I remember I had this moment with my dad when we moved to Arizona, and I saw somebody with an anti-motorcycle helmet bumper sticker, and I said something positive about it. And my dad, who is a motorcycle rider and has been whole adult life, and even before that, said, "No, that's really, really stupid." And I thought, wow, my dad was, he became a dad in 1967, so he should be all hip and liberal about these things. And why is he down on anti-motorcycle helmet laws? And he said, if that guy gets in an accident and is brain damaged and gets put on life support, my insurance
we're going to pay for him for the rest
up.
of his life.
That's right. For the rest of his life,
Absolutely.
I get to pay for him.
You're going to pay for it for the rest of his life.
Yeah. And that's the social contract that people seem to ignore.
You can say, for instance, so a state which requires helmets be worn by motorcycle riders, the state certainly has a valid police power idea to do that.
Or seatbelts.
or the seatbelt laws. I mean, there are lots of things that states are entrusted to do, which they should be entrusted to do.
Yeah.
And some of them they handle very well, and others, like Flint, they don't handle very well.
Well, and it's protecting their citizens, right? Because otherwise, if you knew that the seatbelt law or the helmet law was out there and would save lives and save money, because money, and you didn't enforce it, then somebody could come and get you later for not doing the thing that you had proof you should have been doing.
That's right. And that's what elections are one of the prime things, and lawsuits that change the status quo with that. But elections really, you run against the guys in Michigan, the guys who are responsible for Flint, and the next generation of elections, people all going to vote them out.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. That's what democracy is about. We throw them out.
Right.
They did a bad job. They hurt a lot of people, and we shouldn't be paying them salaries. We should be sending them off to.
We're going to go away with the takeaway, because everybody has heard someone at some point, whether they were joking or not, say, "Oh, my rights are being infringed." And we don't always really know what that means. It could mean that my parents are telling me to turn down my music and I don't want to. And you're infringing on my rights, you horrible parents.
Yeah, but your music is infringing on their rights.
Well, that's the part. That's right. I want my
you
rights
as a
to
parent know that.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes. And as a high school teacher. But but looking at this at the 14th Amendment, the second section, which we didn't talk about at all, seems to be the kind of getting rid of the 3/5 compromise and making sure that any 21-year-old male is allowed to vote, and who hasn't been arrested or part of a rebellion or is a felon. So that's kind of fine. There's not giving aid or comfort to the enemy, and if you do, that prevents you from running for office. Fine. There's a public debt. There's a very Hamiltonian part, Section 4, where we have to pay for our army that defends us.
That's right.
Very Hamilton.
That's right.
That was his big bugaboo. But going back to the Section 1, which is the big one that we started talking about at the beginning, if people were going to walk away with a relatively simple takeaway so that they would know if their rights were being infringed upon, or something that would make them go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. That sounds like it's running up against the Constitution. What would you say that could be summed up as? That's a tough question.
Well, that is a very difficult question. I think you have to have a concept of the two major concepts in Section 1 are liberty and equality. And that's what you have to think about. Those aren't going to give you an instant answer, but they're going to give you a beginning.
Right.
Am I being treated equally here with other citizens?
And is my liberty being infringed upon?
Is my liberty being infringed? And so what is it?
Right.
And then, of course, you may have to define, as we were joking with the teenager and the parents,
right.
Everybody's got liberties, and you can't uphold all of them contrary, because they're contrary to each other.
Right.
So what's good public policy? But start with those two concepts, and then think about
that. Goes into Franklin's those who would reduce their security for the purposes of liberty deserve neither security nor liberty.
No, they will have neither.
They will have neither.
They will have neither.
Yeah. Because that's the erosion of this.
It's giving up. That's the man on the white horse. We have. We live in a mad time, so let somebody solve our problems for us. Elect whatever that means. The man on the white horse. I won't say the woman on the white horse. I thought that might happen, but not yet. So it's still the man on the white horse. The reality is you can't have somebody solve your problems for you that way. Either your own problems as an individual or the problems of society. We have to solve them. We all have a stake in this. And whether we're just ordinary citizens or whether we're legislators, or government employees, we have a responsibility in a democracy for our own fate. And if we don't take that responsibility, we will lose our democracy. And once lost, it is very difficult to get it back.
Oh yeah, that's the part that I've been wondering about, and it makes me think about the oh, now I can't remember the quote. Shoot, it was brilliant. I'll remember it at 3 a.m. I only got about an hour's of sleep last night, so
Don't wake me at 3 a.m. to tell me you remembered the quote. Just send me an email.
I will. I won't even send you an email. I won't want it to ping at you. I'll just leave it open on my desktop.
I turn it off at night.
Oh, good. Thank God. See, because rights and responsibilities. You have the right to turn your phone off. I have the responsibility not to send it to you at 3 a.m. This is how it all works out.
Well, my dear,
thank you so much for meeting with me again. What did we say we were going to do next time?
I don't remember. We can talk about that. It's getting dark here, and the animals are all over me here.
Deal with your animals. I will go ahead and hang out a little longer so I can tell people what's coming up next week, and you can go feed your doggies.
I've got to get them out. Good to see you.
And your parrot. Good to see you too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. All right. So episode 3 is going to be Amendment 1, First Amendment, freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, seeking redress from the government. These are going to be interesting questions for us next week. And that'll be the day after Christmas, won't it? Holy smoke. Go figure. We can celebrate our First Amendment right to say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays. All right. Thank you so much for watching and for participating in the conversation about the Constitution. Don't forget, you can call 206-350-1642 if you want to leave audio feedback that we can then play and use on the live stream next week. And you can show up when we're doing this live stream live at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Eastern time, on every Monday, except when my son has a dentist appointment, which is why we were late today. Thank you so much. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.